Jesus implicitly rejected the Apocrypha of Scripture by referring to the entire accepted Jewish canon of Scripture. He says, quote, "From the blood of Abel," which is a reference to Genesis 4:8, "to the blood of Zechariah," which is a reference to 2 Chronicles, "who was killed between the altar and the house of God, yes, I tell you, it shall be charged against this generation." That's found in Luke 11:51. You can also look at Matthew 23:35, which has the same basic wording. So what is Jesus doing in this passage? Well, Abel was the first martyr in the Old Testament from the book of Genesis, while Zechariah was the last martyr in the book of Chronicles. In the Hebrew canon, the first book was Genesis and the last book was Chronicles. Their Hebrew Bible is basically known as the Tanakh. They contained all the same books as the standard 39 books, which were accepted by Protestants today, but they were just arranged differently. For example, all the 12 minor prophets, Hosea through Malachi, were contained in one book. This is why there are only 24 books in the Hebrew Bible today. By Jesus referring to Abel and Zechariah, he was canvassing the entire canon of the Hebrew Scriptures, which included the same 39 books as Protestants accept today. Therefore, Jesus implicitly rejected the Apocrypha as Scripture. Now, some people will reply and say, well, there was no canon of Scripture that time period. Okay, if there's no official list, that's fine. But Jesus is still making an analogy. He's making a parallel. He's drawing on something. By referring to Abel and Zechariah, he's referring to the first and the last of a series of writings. And that's exactly what we have in the Tanakh today. So Jesus had some sort of list of authoritative scriptures that he at least viewed as having authority. And there's no indications that he viewed the Apocrypha as part of that authoritative writings.
You liar!
I also want you to notice a second passage of Scripture with me, Matthew 23 and verse 35. Jesus there pronounced this upon the wicked Pharisees. He said, "That on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar." Now, this passage is very significant because it covers from the first book of the Bible, Genesis, when it mentions Abel, to the last book of the Hebrew Bible, which was Chronicles, when he mentions Zechariah, which chronologically is the time of Malachi as we have our Bible laid out today. And so here's the point. Jesus recognized as Scripture from Genesis to the time of Malachi, which incidentally excludes the books of the Old Testament Apocrypha.
Liar! Liar!
Get back, witch!
I'm not a witch, I'm your wife! But after what you just said, I'm not even sure I want to be that anymore!
Let me give you one last one here. Luke chapter 11, verse 51. "From the blood of Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, which perished between the altar and the temple, verily I say unto you, it shall be required of this generation." So Jesus is mentioning the first murder, the first killing. And then he is quoting, and when he is talking about Zacharias, he's talking about 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 20 to 22. Now, as the Old Testament Jew laid out the New Testament, their scriptures, they began with the book of Genesis, but they did not end with Malachi as we end with. They ended with Chronicles. And so Jesus here is quoting literally the very first murder, killing, to the very last murder, the last killing. And he's encompassing all of this and giving a scope and sequence of two events, one at the very beginning and one at the very end of what is the Old Testament canon.
You're lying, and I know you're lying.
You lied to me.
You're strong, but I never taught you to lie. That's why you're so bad at it.
Dave, I find your story simply not believable.
Really? What part?
These guys say that Jesus established the canon of Scripture by mentioning Abel to Zechariah, the first murder in the first book, and then the last murder in the last book. And they say that that's how Jesus established the canon of Scripture. Now, are they really telling the truth, or are they lying? Well, this argument is based upon two lies, two underlying lies. First of all, this is This is the book of 2 Chronicles. And here we are in chapter 24. Now this is where it mentions Zechariah. It says here, Then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest, who stood above the people and said to them, Thus says God, why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord, so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has also forsaken you. This is where they kill him. He says, So they conspired against him, and at the command of the king they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness which Jehoiada his father had done to him, but killed his son. And as he died, he said, The Lord look on it and repay. Now, remember, these guys said that when Zechariah, when he is killed, it says, at the command of the king, they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. They're saying that this is the last murder in the Old Testament.
And when he is talking about Zechariah, he's talking about 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 20 to 22. And so Jesus here is quoting literally the very first murder, killing, to the very last murder, the last killing.
Is that really the last murder? Well, look at who's king here. Look at what it says. The king is Joash, okay? The king of Judah at this point in time is Joash the king. Now, Joash was king of Judah about 800 BC. He lived around the time of about 800 BC. So that's when Zechariah was murdered. He was stoned in the temple during the reign of Joash, about 800 BC. This is about 200 years before the Babylonian captivity. Okay? This is when the first temple was still up. First temple had not been destroyed yet. Around 800 BC. Okay? Now, is this really the last murder? Well, no, it's not, because there's another person who was murdered after him. I am in the book of Jeremiah, and this is in chapter 26. And in verse 20, it tells us about a prophet who was murdered in the days of Jeremiah. Verse 20, it says, Now there was also a man who prophesied in the name of the Lord. What is his name? Urijah, the son of Shemaiah of Kiriath-Jearim, who prophesied against this city and against this land according to all the words of Jeremiah. And when Jehoiakim the king, with all of his mighty men and all of his princes, heard his words, the king sought to put him to death. But when Uriah heard of it, he was afraid and fled and went to Egypt. Then Jehoiakim the king sent men to Egypt, Elnathan the son of Achbor and the other men who went with him to Egypt. And they brought Urijah from Egypt and brought him to Jehoiakim the king, who killed him with the sword and cast his dead body into the graves of the common people. So notice how it says that Urijah, the son of Shemaiah of Kiriath-Jearim, prophesied. This is a prophet. And what happened to him? They brought him from Egypt. They brought him to Jehoiakim the king, who killed him with the sword and cast his dead body into the graves. Now, do you know who Jehoiakim is? This guy lived during the Babylonian captivity. This is a son of Josiah. Jehoiakim was actually carried away captive to Babylon during the Babylonian captivity. This is about 600 BC, around about that time period. Okay? I think the captivity was about 586 BC. So Jehoiakim the king, he lived around 600 BC. Now remember, Zechariah from 2 Chronicles lived during the reign of Joash, about 800 BC. This Jehoiakim lived during the reign of around 600 BC. So when Uriah, the son of Shemaiah, when he is murdered by Jehoiakim the king, who killed him with the sword and cast his dead body into the graves, this is 200 years after the Zechariah from 2 Chronicles 24. Now, what did they say? They said that Zechariah from 2 Chronicles 24 is the last killing, the last murder.
To the very last murder, the last killing.
That is not the last killing, because this killing took place 200 years later. They lied. This is not the last killing. This is in the book of Matthew, chapter 23. And in verse 35, Jesus says, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Now this is where Jesus mentions Abel-to-Zechariah. Now notice when Jesus says Zechariah, he says the son of who? The son of Berechiah. Zechariah, son of Berechiah. Now, who is this Zechariah? Well, let's try going to the book of Zechariah. This is the book of Zechariah. And what do we find in the very first verse? In the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, the son of who? The son of Berechiah. Now, could it be that this is the Zechariah who Jesus is talking about, since he mentions him by name? Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. I mean, that's what Jesus said, didn't he? Now, when did he live? Well, it says, in the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius. Darius, this is Darius, king of Persia. Darius reigned over Persia sometime around 500 BC. This is when the second temple was rebuilt. This is after the Babylonian captivity. The second temple was rebuilt and finished and completed during the 6th year of Darius. So this is sometime around 500 BC or so. So this Zechariah, who Jesus is talking about, the son of Berechiah, lived during the reign of Darius, about 500 BC, about 100 years after the Babylonian captivity, after around the time when the second temple was rebuilt. Okay, this is the 2nd year, so it hadn't been quite finished yet, but it was during the 6th year of Darius when the second temple was rebuilt. This is literally 300 years after the Zechariah from 2 Chronicles 24. In 2 Chronicles 24, here I am in 2 Chronicles chapter 24. Notice what it says here. It says, then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of who? Who is he the son of? Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. Did Jesus say Zechariah, son of Jehoiada? No, he didn't say that, did he? He said Zechariah, son of Berechiah. So is Jesus talking about the Zechariah from 2 Chronicles chapter 24, like they said in these videos? Doesn't sound like it. Why would you even think that? Jesus didn't say Zechariah, son of Jehoiada. He said Zechariah, son of Berechiah. And also, when did he live? He lived during the reign of Joash, the king of Judah. Joash. Look it up. Joash lived about 800 BC. This is about 300 years before the Zechariah from the book of Zechariah. Zechariah, son of Berechiah, lived about 300 years after Joash. The Zechariah, son of Berechiah, lived during the reign of Darius, a whole 300 years later. And so, they're lying. In the book of Matthew, chapter 23, Jesus said, Abel, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. And so, Jesus is mentioning the Zechariah from the book of Zechariah, chapter 1, verse 1, during the reign of Darius, about 500 BC. Jesus is not talking about the Zechariah from 2 Chronicles. You know why it wouldn't make sense? Because notice what Jesus says. That on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah. He's basically saying from A to Z, pretty much. From A to Z, first and the last. Well, you can't say that the Zechariah from 2 Chronicles 24 is the last murder, because he's not. Because remember, Uriah, son of Shemaiah. It would make more sense for Jesus to be talking about the Zechariah from the book of Zechariah. That makes a lot more sense. So their whole entire argument of Jesus establishing the canon of Scripture by mentioning Abel-to-Zechariah, their whole entire argument is founded upon this belief that this Zechariah that Jesus mentions is the same Zechariah from 2 Chronicles, and 2 Chronicles being the last book of the Hebrew canon, and Zechariah being the last murder. But the truth is, Zechariah from 2 Chronicles is not the last murder, and Jesus isn't even talking about that Zechariah anyway. So their underlying argument ultimately becomes a lying argument, pretty much. This is called Ethics, an early American handbook. I think these guys could probably learn a lot from this book. It says that it's a reprint of an 1890 original. And in the very beginning of this, they talk about all sorts of ethics. And at the very beginning, they mention truth. Truth is on page 1. That's the first thing they start on. They start on truth. And I think these guys could really learn a lot from this. Primer of ethics, truth. Truth is sincerity. And in all we say and do, we must be sincere. We must not make false impressions. We must not make false impressions directly or indirectly. There are many ways by which we may mislead and deceive others by what we say. And these ways differ very much from each other in criminality. Some of the principal of them are these: saying a thing when we know it is not true, saying a thing when we do not know whether it is true or not. 3, prevaricating. 4, misrepresenting. 5, exaggerating. All these are different forms of untruth. Let us consider them in order. Saying a thing when we know it is not true. This is absolute falsehood, and whoever is habitually guilty of it, after he is old enough to understand the nature of the sin, is depraved. Young men are perhaps most frequently led into this sin at first by having committed some other fault and then telling a lie to conceal it. Sometimes there are circumstances which seem to draw one into the falsehood without any previous intention to say what is not true. This is an interesting story. He says, a boy was led to tell a falsehood in this way, very much as many others have been. There was a deep pond behind his father's garden. Early in the winter it froze over. One morning he took an axe from the shed and cut a hole in the ice to fish. After he had cut the hole, the axe slipped from his hands, fell through the hole, and went to the bottom. The boy ought to have gone at once and told his father, but he was afraid to do this, and so he said nothing about it. Shortly after this, his father wanted the axe and told his son to see if he could find it. If his father had asked him directly if he knew where it was, probably he would have told him the truth. But as he asked him to look for it, the boy said nothing, but went and looked in the shed and in the barn and in the shop, and then came back and said the axe was nowhere to be found. This was dishonest, but it was not strictly false. He had said thus far nothing which was not true, but he was gradually getting himself entangled in a difficulty which it might easily be seen would probably lead him to a direct falsehood. His father, thinking it very strange that the axe should disappear, went with his son to look for it, and on the way he abruptly asked him whether he could not recollect having had it lately, and the boy hastily answered no. He had only an instant to reflect, and in that instant the thought flashed through his mind that he could not now confess that he had lost the axe without exposing the deception that he had practiced in pretending to look for it. And also the thought that was some time before this that he had lost the axe, and his father's question was whether he had seen it lately. This enabled him to quiet his conscience a little, and to flatter himself that he was not telling an absolute lie. The next moment his father asked him whether he had seen it anywhere since they were splitting the log in the shed, And he answered, No, sir. His father then went away, and the son sat down on a log before a woodpile and covered his face with his hands, overwhelmed with the bitter reflection that he had been gradually led on to tell his father an absolute and unqualified lie. His peace of mind was destroyed. All that afternoon and evening he was afraid to meet his father for fear he would say something about the axe. The sight of the shed, of the woodpile, of the ice, and even of the wood burning in the fireplace seemed to recall to his mind the thoughts of his sin, and he was afraid all the time that his father would go down to the pond and see the hole cut in the ice, and so would discover his guilt. At first, he thought that the hole would soon freeze over again, but then he reflected that it would leave a sort of scar upon the spot, which would perhaps remain all winter to reproach and betray him. At night he could not sleep, and at last he was so miserable that he got up and he went to his father's chamber and confessed that he had lost the axe through the ice and had told falsehoods about it. And he said that he was so wretched in consequence that he did not know what to do. It is very often, in a way somewhat like this, that young people are led to tell their first willful falsehoods. Then, unless they go and confess them honestly, like this boy did, they bear the reproaches of conscience for a time, until they gradually forget the offense, and then, on the next occasion, they commit the sin a little more deliberately and with less compunction. They go on very fast in the downward course. When they have thus begun, they say what is false more and more frequently and boldly, until at length they are ready at any time to tell a lie to conceal their faults or to gain their wishes. Their characters always become known. Neither their parents nor their children can believe them, and even their acquaintances know that there is no dependence to be placed upon anything they say. I can't help but think that, Protestant leaders started off by saying that the Apocrypha doesn't belong in the Bible because, after all, the Jews don't accept these books. And, one lie leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another lie. And eventually these Bible teachers, they eventually just have to tell you just blatant falsehoods, blatant lies, in order to cover up the previous lies, in order to cover the previous lie before that, and eventually they end up telling just complete blatant lies.